The streets of Helena are lined with remnants of yesterday's past. Whether it is an old church nestled in neighborhoods lined with historic homes that once housed large pioneer families, to public institutional buildings that the public of today still utilize. It all holds significance to our little town, even if you're not aware of it. Much of these structures and institutions of Helena's past can be contributed to a man that ventured to Last Chance Gulch in 1865 by the name of Cornelius Hedges. He may not be a common Helena name like T.C. Powers or Thomas Cruise, but he is one of the most significant contributors to the development of the city of Helena.
I just had a great time researching Cornelius. He was significant to Montana's history, and I just didn't know how much. So he was born in Massachusetts to a farmer, and he went to school at Yale, was called Yale College at the time, and he graduated and taught school for a while, and then he went to Harvard Law School. So he was a pretty intelligent guy. He loved to read when he was younger. He was very well spoken, really articulate, well versed in writing, a great writer. And so he went into law, and then he met a young woman while he was at Yale, and they got married, and they decided to go to Iowa, Independence, Iowa, for a few years. And that was, I think, because his sister was there. And while there, they kind of went back and forth between New England and Iowa. But at some point in 1864, he heard about what was then Idaho Territory, which included Montana at the time, the gold there. And he said, okay, to his wife Edna, who he had married right after he got out of law school. I want to go there, and I want to see if I can strike it rich. So he went to Virginia City, and it was backbreaking work for very little money. He bought some mining claim, didn't pan out. And eventually he made his way to Virginia. He made his way to Helena. And when he got to Helena, he decided to just practice law. And he also had a little mining claim on the side, but primarily he practiced law. And he was appointed a U.S. attorney, which started something that he did for a number of years after that. When I researched him, he wasn't a T.C. Power, he wasn't a Holter, he didn't make a lot of money, he wasn't considered a magnate, but he was a person who really did a lot for his community. And there was this quote that I really liked that I wanted to share with you that I think kind of sums him up. The lives of some shine out as grand examples of prosperity and success achieved through various channels of industry. In reviewing the life of Judge Hedges, he is not the man who seeks to blazon his deeds for personal gratification or from motives of ambition to perform some act that would mark him for a time as a central figure. To those who know him best, that inward greatness which is his and the beauty of his character is more thoroughly understood, and the marvel is that nature seldom makes a man like him. Basically, his motivation was he was dedicated to promote a better place to live in a world that was not quite so perfect. And that probably describes him best of all my research. But things that stand out, he was part of what was called the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, who went to Yellowstone in 1870. And, it was a party of a number of men, not just those three. And they were going there to look at, they had heard about this place that had all this natural beauty. And some of them started talking about using it to make a resort there and make all kinds of improvements and extract things. And And Cornelius said, why, this is all fine, but why don't we save this for all of us, this natural beauty, preserve this natural beauty for everyone to enjoy as a national park? And while some scholars say that he was one of a number of people, or a few people, I think there are a couple of other people who were Langford, N.P. Langford, Nathaniel Langford, who was a good friend of Cornelius's, and another gentleman who was a senator who really pushed to get Yellowstone made into a park. But the actual idea to preserve it as a park, and there's that word again, preserve, and in its natural state, is generally, that idea is generally attributed to Cornelius. And so a lot of people call him the father of the National Park Service. And you'll hear this about a number of things that he did. He's called the father of Freemasonry in Montana. He was the the person who was probably the most influential in getting the library, the Helena Library, as we know it, the Lewis and Clark Library now, that was called the Helena Free Library, I think. So, when he died in 1907, the library closed for 6 hours to recognize his importance to its founding. He was one of the original founders of the Montana Historical Society. All these things that are really significant that you never heard about. And so I'm so impressed with him, and yet he was such a modest person, never one to toot his own horn and say what he did. And so I found just remarkable things about him that really make me respect him so much. And he had journals that he kept most of his life, and so you get to read it in the first person. He was also he was into newspapers starting out very early on. So when he was in Iowa, on his trip, that eventually led to Montana, he started a newspaper there. And when he was in Helena, he was an editor for the Helena Herald. So he was involved in all these things, the Masons, his church. He started out in the Methodist Church, went to the Presbyterian Church, even though he was a Congregationalist in New England, but there were no Congregationalist churches in Helena at the time. So he was a trustee, and then he was appointed. As the the superintendent of public instruction for the territory very early on. So for about 8 years, he set about establishing and improving schools throughout the territory, and then he became the first superintendent of public instruction, which a lot of people don't know. So you've got the library, education, Freemasonry, his church, and newspaper. He had his hands in so many things, and the Yellowstone National Park. There's so many things that he is significant for that I don't think a lot of people realize. Is just not publicized. And he had 8 children. He and his wife had 8 children. 2 of them didn't survive past childhood, but then he still had 6 children, and it makes me tired just reading about him.
On the corner of Rodney and Broadway was the Cornelius Hedges home. It was built in 1878. It took 7 months to build at a cost of $4,550. But the first Cornelius Hedges family house was on Joliet Street, which no longer exists, but once was located by the current Lewis and Clark Public Library.
And I have a photograph of it, and I cracked up because it was this log cabin, and I can just imagine him bringing his wife, who grew up in Connecticut, and showing her this little log cabin and saying, "This is where we're living." She must have cried, I'm just thinking, with 2 little kids. So they weren't there very long. They found another house, and then eventually, before they built the 1878 house, they were in another house on what we call Broadway, which was called Broad Street. So in 1878, they had built a house prior to the 1878 house. stayed there, and then they built this house, which had 14 rooms in it when it was built. It was pretty large. They had, like I said, 6 to 8 kids at any one time, and it was a beautiful house. Apparently, had a great library in it because he was always a person who amassed books, and he would loan them to people, and so he had a great library. He loved to read. That was his thing. And when it was built, it had brick veneer. It had very tall windows, which were of the style that the 1870s windows were often tall with a rounded top, and it had what was called a belvedere on the very top of it. It was looked like a little cupola, and it had 4 sides with windows and a little spire on the top. And it was quite a beautiful house. The bricks came down in the 1935 earthquake, and the siding that you see now, I'm not sure if that was what was put on, but it was a different siding, and windows were changed at some point. And the house actually, so his wife lived there up until her death, I think in 1912, and then her son inherited it. And sometime in the 30s, it became a funeral parlor. For about 30 years, 30s to the 60s, and then it went into different ownership. Was an apartment building, sometime in the 2000s back to a single family house, and I'm not sure exactly when it went to 4 apartments.
All these years, the Cornelius Hedges house has been in use until 2018, when the structure was ravaged by a devastating fire. Now it sits empty and boarded up because the fire left significant damage and now is uninhabitable.
The Cornelius Hedges house, as you know, it had a fire so it was December of 2018. It had a fire, and the owner at that time intended to preserve it. I met with him along with the State Historic Preservation Office, and we talked to him about historic tax credits. Unfortunately, he did not have sufficient insurance, and also his health was not in the best place, and he decided, he did try very hard to try and get the place rehabbed. I do know I did speak with the city building official at the time, and he told me that because there was so much water in the building, all the wiring had to be replaced. The heating system, which had caused the fire, of course, had to be completely redone. The roof was burned. The walls were okay, was my understanding. But if you intended to use it as a 4 apartment unit, 4-unit apartment, I think it was 4 or 8 units, I can't remember at this point. But you would have to create firewalls between all the units, which drove the price up to more than what the owner was able to pay for at that point. And so I don't know if it's condemned so much as it's just the price to rehab it into its use as a multi-family housing was too expensive for anyone who was willing to take it on. So the current owners, is my understanding, they have applied for a demolition permit to demolish it. So I received their application in December of 2020, and I sent back some comments on designs in January. I literally got it like on the 30th of December, and I sent them comments in mid-January, and I haven't heard back since then. So I'm hoping it's still alive. I haven't reached out to them about it.
Though the future of the Cornelius house is unknown, the man who built it lives on. In our city streets, in our public spaces like the Public Library, Montana Historical Society, and the public school system and Yellowstone National Park, just to name a few.